It is the 5th of March, 1940, and somewhere in the grey chop of the North Atlantic, something enormous is moving very fast. There is no convoy around it, no destroyer escort flanking its bow, no aircraft circling overhead. It travels alone. And in the language of naval warfare, traveling alone in these waters is tantamount to a death wish. German U-boats have already sent hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. The wolf packs are active, the hunting is good, and anything that floats is a target. And yet this vessel is not stopping. It is not zigzagging in the conventional sense. It is not broadcasting distress signals or radio chatter. It simply moves at 32 knots, burning through the darkness, its silhouette fractured by the most extraordinary paint scheme anyone sailing the Atlantic has ever seen. The ship is RMS Queen Mary. Until 18 months ago, she was the most celebrated ocean liner afloat, the pride of the Cunard White Star Line, a floating palace of Art Deco grandeur that carried Hollywood royalty, European heads of state, and the simply wealthy across the Atlantic in a comfort that bordered on the obscene. Her interiors featured wood paneling from 60 different species of timber. Her first-class swimming pool was tiled in turquoise and cream. Her kitchens could produce 4,000 meals a day. She held the blue riband, the record for the fastest Atlantic crossing. And she wore that distinction with the serene confidence of a ship that knew exactly what she was. Now she is something else entirely. Her funnels, once painted the reassuring buff and black of peacetime Cunard, are a different color altogether. Her hull, once sleek and dark, is covered in geometric shapes and angles that seem to make her edges dissolve and her dimensions blur. She looks, in the words of one sailor who served aboard her during this period, like someone had handed a canvas to a man who had never seen a ship and told him to paint the sea. She is, in the truest sense of the term, a ghost. And the trick that made her one would go on to save thousands of lives, confound the finest submarine commanders in the Kriegsmarine, and reshape the way the world thought about concealment, perception, and the fundamental nature of what it means to hide something in plain sight. This is the story of Dazzle Camouflage, and why the British used it to turn the world's greatest ocean liner into one of the war's most elusive targets. To understand why the Queen Mary needed disguising at all, you have to appreciate the particular brutality of the war at sea in the early 1940s. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single engagement. It was a grinding, unrelenting campaign that began on the very first day of the war, September 3rd, 1939, when the passenger liner SS Athenia was torpedoed by U-30 within hours of Britain's declaration, killing 117 people. From that moment forward, the sea lanes of the North Atlantic became the most dangerous stretch of water in the world. The German U-boat arm, the Kriegsmarine's Unterseebootwaffe, had entered the war with a fleet of around 60 operational submarines. Under the strategic direction of Admiral Karl Dönitz, these vessels were deployed in coordinated groups, what the Germans called Rudeltaktik, and what the Allies came to dread as Wolfpack tactics. A convoy might be shadowed for days, the U-boats radioing back its position and course to headquarters, until enough submarines had gathered for a coordinated night attack. In the first year of the war alone, the U-boats sank over 2 million tons of Allied shipping. By the peak of the crisis in 1942, That figure would rise to nearly 8 million tons in a single year. Against this backdrop, the problem posed by the Queen Mary and her sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, was immense. These vessels were simply too large and too fast to incorporate into standard convoy procedures. A convoy travels at the speed of its slowest vessel, typically 8 to 10 knots for a loaded merchantman. The Queens could manage 32 knots in a favorable sea, a speed that no operational U-boat of the war could match either on the surface or submerged. A surfaced U-boat of the Type 7 class, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, could manage 17 knots at best on the surface and barely 8 knots submerged. The solution to protecting the Queens then was not to surround them with escorts they would simply outrun, but to make them so difficult to identify, track, and target that a U-boat commander who spotted one would be unable to do anything useful with the information before the vessel had vanished over the horizon. But speed alone was not protection enough. A U-boat didn't need to outrun its target. It needed only to position itself ahead of the target's predicted course and wait. And to do that, a commander needed two things: an accurate identification of the vessel and a reliable estimate of its speed and heading. Take away either of those, and the torpedo solution becomes impossible. The challenge facing British naval planners was not how to make the Queen Mary invisible. It was how to make her unreadable. The answer had been proposed once before in an earlier war by a man whose thinking was so unconventional that the naval establishment had taken years to accept it. His name was Norman Wilkinson, and he was a British marine artist and naval officer who had served in the Dardanelles campaign of 1915. Wilkinson had noticed something that seemed obvious once you knew to look for it: that in wartime, no ship could be made truly invisible against the sea and sky. The ocean is too dynamic, the light too variable, the vessel too large. Conventional camouflage, painting something to match its background, worked perfectly well for a stationary tank in a woodland. It was nearly useless for a vessel moving through an environment that changed color and texture by the hour. The attempt to paint ships gray or blue or dull green had achieved little beyond making the sailors who chipped and repainted them miserable. Wilkinson's insight was radical. Rather than trying to conceal the ship, he proposed to confuse the observer. His system, which he called Dazzle, and which the Admiralty eventually accepted in the summer of 1917, covered the hull and superstructure of a vessel in a riot of intersecting geometric shapes, bold stripes, contrasting curves, and disrupted angles. The shapes were not random. Each pattern was specifically designed to make it difficult for a U-boat commander peering through a periscope to determine two critical things: the true heading of the vessel and its speed. The patterns played tricks with the eye's natural tendency to find edges and follow lines. Sharply contrasting stripes painted at angles across the bow could make the ship appear to be pointing in a different direction from its actual course. False bow waves painted in white could suggest different speeds. Shapes around the stern and funnel could blur the proportions of the vessel and confuse identification. The facility responsible for developing these patterns in the Second World War was not, as one might expect, housed in some grand naval establishment. Much of the theoretical and practical work on Dazzle and disruptive camouflage was conducted through a network of artists, designers, and scientists working across institutions that ranged from the Royal Academy to the University of Oxford's Department of Zoology, where a young academic named Hugh Cott had been publishing research on disruptive coloration in animals, research that turned out to have profound military applications. The Camouflage Directorate, established under the War Office in 1940, drew on this cross-disciplinary pool with an eclecticism that was quintessentially British and which periodically baffled the more rigidly structured German military establishment. The patterns applied to the Queen Mary and other troopships were worked out through a combination of practical testing and optical theory. Scale models of vessels, typically around 60 centimeters, roughly 2 feet in length, were painted with proposed schemes and then examined through devices that simulated the view through a submarine periscope at varying distances and in different light conditions. The observer's task was to estimate the model's heading and speed. Patterns that consistently produced wrong estimates were retained. Patterns that allowed accurate readings were discarded. It was, in essence, a scientifically run test of human visual confusion, and the results were taken seriously enough to be applied to some of the most valuable vessels in the Allied fleet. For the Queen Mary, the practical application of this system was staggering in scale. She was 310 meters, just over 1,000 feet, in length, and displaced more than 81,000 tons. Painting her was not a delicate studio exercise. It required hundreds of workers, tons of paint, and a dry dock large enough to accommodate her. The patterns were transferred from small-scale diagrams to the full hull using a system of grids, with teams of painters working from scaffolding on sections that were then matched to adjacent sections with painstaking care. The colors used were not subtle. The Queen Mary, at various points in her wartime career, wore schemes involving gray, blue, black, and white, in combinations that were deliberately jarring, deliberately angular, deliberately wrong-looking in a way that was, in fact, precisely right. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. In service as a troopship, the Queen Mary's operational record during the war was extraordinary. Between 1940 and 1945, she transported more than 765,000 military personnel, American, British, Australian, Canadian, and others, across the Atlantic and to theaters of war across the globe. Her single most celebrated voyage in terms of sheer numbers was made in July 1943, when she carried 16,683 American soldiers from New York to the Clyde in a single crossing. That figure remains, to this day, the largest number of people ever transported on a single vessel in recorded history. Throughout these crossings, she was the subject of intense German attention. The U-boat command knew she was operating. The movement of so many soldiers could not be entirely concealed, and hunting the Queen Mary became, for a time, something of a priority target. Admiral Dönitz reportedly offered an Iron Cross and a cash reward of 250,000 Reichsmarks to any U-boat commander who could sink her. None collected. The combination of her speed, her unpredictable routing — she never crossed the Atlantic on the same course twice in succession — and the visual confusion generated by her Dazzle pattern made her, in practical terms, extraordinarily difficult to target. Survivors' accounts from the period and the testimony of sailors who served aboard her describe the experience of watching her move through water as deeply disorienting. At any distance beyond a few hundred meters, the geometric patterning made it genuinely difficult to resolve where her bow was pointing or how fast she was moving. At range, at the distance from which a submarine commander would typically be making his firing calculations. The effect was, by multiple accounts, striking. The ship seemed to shift, to twist, to present angles that didn't quite correspond to what the observer's brain told him should be there. This was not illusion in the theatrical sense. It was applied perceptual science, and it worked. There were tragedies connected to the Queen Mary's wartime service that had nothing to do with enemy action. In October 1942, while maneuvering at speed off the coast of Ireland, she accidentally struck and sank her own escort vessel, HMS Curacoa, killing 338 Royal Navy sailors. The accident was the consequence of a pre-planned collision avoidance protocol that was misunderstood, and it remained classified for years after the war. The Queen Mary, unable to stop or circle back for fear of U-boats, continued on her course. It is among the most painful episodes connected to any vessel in the Second World War, and it is remembered with all the gravity it deserves. The British did not have a monopoly on camouflage theory during the war, and it is worth examining how the German approach compared. The Kriegsmarine, in general, favored more traditional forms of concealment, painting their vessels in shades of grey that varied by theatre and season, attempting to match the vessel's appearance to the typical background of the waters in which it operated. The battleship Bismarck, for example, wore a scheme of dark grey with a false bow wave painted in white, intended to disrupt the visual reading of her size and speed. But this was a relatively conservative approach, by comparison with the full Dazzle system applied to Allied troop ships. The Germans produced some innovative thinking on camouflage, particularly with regard to their U-boats, whose conning towers were sometimes painted to reduce their radar and visual cross-section. But the fundamental intellectual approach was different, where the British, drawing on the tradition of natural history, zoology and fine art, thought in terms of disrupting perception. The German tendency was more often to think in terms of literal concealment. The two approaches reflected, in miniature, a broader difference in the way the two nations approached the problem of innovation under pressure. The American approach, developed in parallel with the British and subject to considerable cross-pollination, tended toward the systematic and the statistical. American naval camouflage research in the early 1940s produced a series of rigorously tested schemes, some of which incorporated elements of Dazzle alongside low visibility measures. The USS West Point, the American troop ship equivalent to the Queen Mary, formerly the liner SS America, operated with a camouflage scheme that owed a clear debt to British Dazzle theory, though it was developed and refined independently by American researchers at institutions including the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. The legacy of Dazzle camouflage extends well beyond the Second World War, and in some directions its influence has been both surprising and lasting. The principle of disrupting perception rather than achieving concealment, of making something hard to read rather than hard to see, was absorbed into military thinking in ways that persisted through the Cold War and into the era of stealth technology. Modern stealth aircraft do not attempt to be invisible to the naked eye. They attempt to be unreadable to radar systems in precisely the same way that a Dazzle-painted vessel attempted to be unreadable to a periscope observer. The logic is identical. Confuse the instrument of observation, and the target becomes operationally useless even when it is physically present. In the world of fashion, the influence has been more explicit and perhaps less expected. The geometric disruptive patterns that Norman Wilkinson developed in 1917 and that were refined through the Second World War became, in the hands of designers such as Sonia Delaunay and later figures working in the tradition of op art, an aesthetic vocabulary in their own right. The angular, contrasting patterns that were designed to confuse submarine commanders became, by the 1960s, a visual language associated with modernity, energy, and deliberate visual provocation, which is, when you think about it, exactly what they were designed to produce. The Queen Mary herself can be seen today, though not in her wartime colors. After her service as a troop ship concluded in 1946, she was returned to Cunard, refitted, repainted in her original livery, and returned to the transatlantic run that had made her famous. She continued in commercial service until 1967, when she was retired and sold. She now rests permanently in Long Beach, California, serving as a hotel, a museum, and an event venue. Visitors can walk her decks, eat in her restored restaurant, and tour sections of her engine room. Photographs from her wartime service, including images showing the Dazzle scheme in various configurations, are preserved in the archives of the Imperial War Museum in London, where they remain among the more visually striking artifacts of a conflict that produced visual strangeness in abundance. Return for a moment to that grey morning in March 1940. The Queen Mary is moving fast through cold water. Below the waterline, her 4 propellers, each one over 6 meters in diameter, each one weighing more than 35 tons, are turning at a rate that translates to 32 knots of forward speed. The sound she generates can be heard many miles away by anyone with a hydrophone. She is, in terms of physical presence, impossible to miss. She is enormous, she is loud, she is trailing a wake that stretches for miles behind her. She is, in every conventional sense, not hidden at all. And yet, to the German U-boat commander, who might be watching her through his periscope from 1,000 meters away, she is something closer to a puzzle than a target. The lines of her hull do not resolve cleanly into a heading. The angular shapes across her bow suggest she is turning when she is not. The disrupted pattern across her midsection makes her length difficult to estimate. Her bow wave, rendered ambiguous by paint, offers no reliable indication of her speed. The firing solution that a commander needs, a precise combination of target heading, target speed, and target range, simply will not come together in the time available before she has passed beyond effective range. And so he watches her go and notes her position and reports back to headquarters. And the Queen Mary sails on. She carried 765,000 soldiers. She was never hit. She was never significantly damaged by enemy action. She crossed some of the most dangerous waters in the world more times than anyone has ever thought to count. And she did it alone, at speed, wearing a coat of paint that told every observer who looked at her that she was not quite what she appeared to be, not quite where she seemed to be, not quite heading in the direction she appeared to be heading. The ship that hid in plain sight by refusing to be legible, the luxury liner that became a ghost, the trick that was not really a trick at all, but a piece of applied science so elegant that it worked better in practice than anyone had dared promise in theory. The ship that wasn't where you thought she was, and the paint that made it so.